On May 20, 2025, a storm began not with tanks or bullets, but with a voice. A voice that dared to do what history has rarely seen, confront the empire. Captain Ibrahim Traore stood in Ouagadougou and looked straight through the cameras, through the walls, through the years of silence, and said, "Macron, your time of meddling in Africa is over." Not whispered. Not softened. Delivered like thunder across the continent. For generations, Africa has been spoken for, carved up, bought, sold, and silenced. But now, a soldier-turned-leader has sent the message loud enough for the world to hear. France called it diplomacy, Traore called it deceit. They called it partnership, he called it control. And he didn't just say it for Burkina Faso. He said it for every elder who remembers the CFA franc, for every mother who lost a son to proxy wars, for every African who's waited too long to stand free. This story isn't just about headlines, it's about dignity reclaimed. If you believe Africa's time has come, drop a comment below. And if you want to hear the stories they buried, subscribe now. Stay with us because this is no ordinary tale. This is the sound of a continent rising. It was a warm afternoon in Ouagadougou. The sun hung high above the crowd as Burkina Faso hosted delegates from the United Arab Emirates. Cameras rolled, journalists waited, and ministers shuffled papers. No one expected the history that was about to be made. Captain Ibrahim Traore took the stage, not as a polite host, but as a man with a mission. He wasn't there to shake hands. He was there to shake the foundation. He stood firm, eyes fixed on the front row, and raised a stack of papers. "These," he said, "are proof. Proof," he claimed, "of French intelligence operations inside Burkina Faso. Espionage, sabotage, manipulation." His voice did not crack. It echoed through the hall like a drum beat from another century. "We have the evidence," he declared, "and we will not bow to your schemes." The room froze. Some ministers whispered. Others stared. It wasn't just a claim. It was an accusation, direct and undeniable. And the target? None other than French President Emmanuel Macron. The same Macron who had spent months calling for unity in Europe, peace in the Middle East, and cooperation in the Sahel. Now exposed according to Traore as the architect of hidden agendas in Africa. Traore's words were sharp, his tone controlled, but the message thundered. He accused France of spying. Not yesterday. Not decades ago. Now. Under Macron's leadership. Not with tanks or soldiers but with wires, whispers, and money. "You speak of peace," he said, "but you plant unrest. You speak of friendship, but you play the puppeteer." The impact was instant. Within minutes, hashtags began trending across Francophone and Anglophone Africa. Hashtag Africarissing. Hashtag TraoreTruth. A voice from Ghana tweeted, "Traore didn't just speak, he opened the archives." A South African activist wrote, "He said what millions have felt for years." But it wasn't just the social media world that reacted. Diplomats in Paris scrambled. Embassies called for clarification. The Élysée Palace, caught off guard, issued a one-line statement: "We reject unproven claims and remain committed to African partnership." That was all. One sentence to answer a storm. The French media did not lead with Traore's words. Instead, they chose a distraction, an awkward moment involving Brigitte Macron during a visit to Vietnam. Headlines shifted. Screens lit up with gossip, not geopolitics. But Africa was not distracted. Africa was watching. Because this wasn't just a speech. It was a signal. That something had changed. That a new generation of African leadership was no longer content with silence. That France could no longer hide behind handshakes and summit photos. That someone, finally, had said, "Enough." Burkina Faso had already taken bold steps in recent years. Expelling French troops. Kicking out the French ambassador. Closing down media like France 24 and RFI. But this was different. This was personal. This was direct. And Traoré, dressed not in medals but in purpose, stood as the face of a new resistance. Many wondered why now. Why speak so boldly? The answer was simple, because it needed to be said. And because no one else dared say it. Traoré didn't just accuse a world power. He dared the world to respond. And in doing so, he crossed a line that African leaders have long avoided, the line between diplomacy and defiance. If you're hearing this and it moves something in you, drop your thoughts in the comments. Would you have said the same, if you stood where he stood? And if this story reminds you of how long Africa has waited to be heard, don't keep quiet. Subscribe now and let your voice echo with ours. Because this is just the beginning. The storm has only begun. France did not roar back. It blinked. As Traoré's words echoed across the continent, Paris responded with restraint, not fire. The official statement from the Élysée was brief, even cold, unproven accusations. France remains committed to constructive dialogue. No denial. No counter-evidence. Just silence wrapped in politeness. And that silence. It spoke volumes. French media, too, sidestepped the storm. Rather than confront the accusations head-on, headlines focused on something else entirely: Brigitte Macron being shoved during a photo op in Vietnam. A minor tabloid moment inflated into national distraction. But Africa wasn't fooled. Not this time. Not when the accusations weren't just scandal, they were strategy. Because what Traoré exposed wasn't a single act of spying. It was a pattern. A system. A habit of empire. A habit France had perfected since its colonial days. A habit that, for decades, no one dared interrupt. Until now. And yet, the reaction or lack of it wasn't just defensive. It was tactical. Macron knew he was being boxed in. To respond directly would elevate Traoré's claims. To ignore them risked looking guilty. So, France chose the gray zone: denial without details, diplomacy without emotion. But the truth has a way of leaking through cracks. Just a few weeks before Traoré's speech, Burkina Faso had announced the dismantling of a coup attempt. Not by rebels. Not by foreign mercenaries. But by soldiers. Insiders. Men trained by foreign armies. Men with knowledge of the palace. Men, the government claimed, connected to networks operating beyond our borders. Traoré didn't name France during that press conference. But he didn't need to. The implication was heavy in the air. And now, with this speech, he made it plain: the attempted coup and the spying came from the same source, the former colonial master, unwilling to lose control. For Macron, the timing couldn't have been worse. Just days earlier, he had stood in Singapore at the Shangri-La Dialogue, warning about the dangers of a divided world. He spoke of unity, of trust, of France's role as a bridge between East and West. But back in West Africa, his image was crumbling. His credibility shattered by a soldier with truth in his hands. Traoré's accusation tore through that carefully managed image. While Macron claimed neutrality, Traoré claimed betrayal. While Macron promised partnership, Traoré described puppet strings. And as the speech replayed across newsrooms from Algiers to Atlanta, it became clear, this wasn't just about one country. It was about an entire continent breaking its silence. Even Macron's allies began to worry. In Brussels, some questioned whether France's approach in Africa had backfired. In the United Nations, diplomats whispered about unnecessary escalation. And across African capitals, leaders watched closely, not to condemn Traoré, but to study him. Could this be done? Could a small nation stand up to a former empire and not be crushed? Traoré believed so. And his people believed with him. Just days after the speech, thousands gathered in Ouagadougou. Not in fear. In celebration, they waved flags, chanted his name, and carried banners that read, "No more puppets." It was more than support, it was a signal that the people were ready to fight, not with guns, but with pride, with voice. And France? France watched. Quietly. Carefully. Perhaps calculating its next move. Economic pressure? Covert operations? Support for opposition groups? The options were many, but the cost was rising. Because this time, the target was not just a man. It was a movement. If you've ever doubted that a voice can shake empires, remember this moment. And if you believe it's time for Africa to speak on its own terms, let us know in the comments. What would you do if your nation was being watched? And more importantly, what would you say if the whole world was listening? Speak it now. Speak it loud. And don't forget to subscribe. Because this story isn't finished. It's just getting louder. History doesn't move in straight lines, it echoes. And in the heart of Burkina Faso, an echo just became thunder. Because long before Captain Ibrahim Traoré stood before cameras and exposed French interference, another man stood in the same city and declared, "He who feeds you, controls you." His name was Thomas Sankara. And for millions of Africans, he was more than a president. He was a prophet. Sankara, too, challenged France. He, too, rejected the CFA franc, the colonial currency still used by 14 African nations, controlled by the French treasury. He warned that no nation could be truly free if it depended on its former master to print its money. And for that truth, he paid the highest price. In 1987, Sankara was assassinated. His killers were trained, funded, and sheltered by powers with interests too deep to lose. His death silenced a generation. His name became sacred but untouchable. Until now. Traoré isn't trying to be Sankara. He doesn't speak in poetry or wear military berets for nostalgia. He's raw. He's direct. He's a soldier who saw war and chose politics not for glory, but for sovereignty. Yet the connection is undeniable. When he stood and accused France of spying, of subversion, of manipulation, he wasn't just speaking for today. He was finishing a sentence left incomplete in 1987. And the people heard it? Not just in Ouagadougou, but in Dakar, in Abidjan, in Kinshasa. Across the continent, Sankara's ghost stirred. Not with sorrow. With pride. Because this isn't just about espionage. It's about memory. About the deep, unhealed wound of colonialism that continues to fester in economic contracts, foreign bases, and cooperation agreements. The CFA franc isn't just currency, it's a leash. And Traoré's speech was a knife. In that moment, it wasn't just Macron on trial. It was history. The treaties signed at gunpoint. The coups planned in foreign embassies. The natural wealth extracted for someone else's profit. Traoré was not asking questions, he was issuing verdicts. But what makes this different, what makes it powerful, is that Traoré didn't come with blame alone. He came with belief. Belief that Africa can feed itself, defend itself, teach itself, and fund itself if it finally breaks free of mental and economic chains. He called on Africans to decolonize their minds. A phrase that might sound abstract until you realize it's the key. Because colonization was never just about borders. It was about breaking the spirit. And reclaiming that spirit begins not with guns but with truth. That's why this moment matters. It's not just geopolitical. It's psychological. For every elder who grew up under French rule. For every son who watched his country's resources flow to Paris. For every daughter told that progress comes from foreign aid, not African genius, Traoré's defiance is a mirror. And in that mirror, we see the unfinished revolution. So now, we ask you, those who've lived through the lies, the betrayals, the silence, is this the moment you waited for? Is this the voice you hoped would rise? If you believe this is what Africa needed all along, say amen in the comments below. Let the ancestors hear it. Let the world see it. And if you want to follow this journey of truth, resistance, and rebirth, hit that subscribe button now. Because these aren't just headlines. They're footsteps toward freedom. Burkina Faso didn't just speak, it acted. Long before the speech that shook Macron's image, Traoré had already begun cutting the ropes that bound his nation to its former colonizer. In early 2023, he ordered the immediate withdrawal of all French troops stationed on Burkinabe soil. No negotiation. No delay. Within weeks, military convoys once protected by tricolor flags were gone. That alone was enough to rattle Paris. But he didn't stop there. The French ambassador was expelled, declared persona non grata. Not for a scandal, but for symbolism. Because Traoré understood something powerful: the presence of the empire is not just in armies, it's in language, media, protocol. So, he shut down France 24. Shut down RFI. These weren't just media outlets, they were megaphones of influence. For too long, they shaped the narrative. Now, Traoré was taking it back. And while the West watched in stunned silence, another power moved closer. Russia. By mid-2024, Burkina Faso had signed multiple agreements with Moscow: military, energy, mining. What was once whispered in diplomatic halls now became official: Russian soldiers were training Burkinabe forces. Russian engineers were assisting with national infrastructure. And in May 2025, just days before his viral speech, Traoré visited Moscow. He didn't tiptoe into the Kremlin. He shook Vladimir Putin's hand. Cameras flashed. Flags waved. And in that moment, a message rang clear: Africa was no longer a backyard, it was a battlefield of influence. Some in the West called it reckless. Others, traitorous. But on the streets of Ouagadougou, the people saw something else: options. For decades, the narrative was fixed: Africa needed France, needed the West. Now, Traoré was showing that partnerships could be chosen, not inherited. Burkina Faso latest news trend: not just for what was said, but for what was done. Removing French language from schools. Announcing a new national media platform led by African journalists. Rewriting trade deals to prioritize local ownership. It was no longer a rebellion, it was reconstruction. And yes, it was risky. France controls financial systems, international platforms, and wields quiet power in corridors that shape aid, sanctions, and perception. But Traoré wasn't waiting for permission. He was building a future in full view, daring the world to stop him. He once said, "We cannot speak of independence while depending on the very hands that bound us." That sentence echoed across Sahel. In Bamako. In Niamey. In Conakry. One by one, nations bruised by foreign meddling began turning toward alternative paths. Some with China. Others with Russia. A few alone. The West responded with warnings. Sanctions. Editorials painting Traoré as a puppet of Moscow. But on the ground, among the people, a different story unfolded. In April 2025, after foiling the alleged coup, thousands flooded the streets chanting his name. Old men with walking sticks raised fists. Mothers held babies above crowds. Youths painted slogans across government walls: Sankara lives in Traoré. It wasn't worship, it was recognition. Recognition that for the first time in a long time, a leader was not begging the West, but challenging it. Not apologizing for sovereignty, but declaring it. And as the world watched this realignment unfold, it became clear: Africa was picking sides, but on its own terms. So now, we turn to you. Do you believe Traoré's pivot is courage or danger? Do you trust the East more than the West? Or do you believe Africa must stand alone? Drop your thoughts in the comments. We read every voice. And if you want to stay updated as this new chapter unfolds, subscribe now. Because this isn't just Burkina Faso's story. It's Africa rewriting the rules. Captain Ibrahim Traore may be the face on the screen, the name in the headlines, but this moment it's not just about him. It never was. Because behind the camera flashes and press releases, something deeper is moving. A continent is waking up. Look beyond Ouagadougou, and you'll see the signs. In Mali, soldiers in uniform no longer salute Paris. In Niger, protesters burned foreign flags and raised their own with pride. In Guinea, national radio plays songs about sovereignty, not subservience. The wind is shifting not toward any one man, but toward a mindset. A demand. A refusal. This is no longer about Captain Ibrahim alone. It's about a shared fire rekindled across African capitals, the right to chart one's own future without Western whispers in the room. The right to say no without consequence. The right to decide without permission. This, friends, is the real Captain Ibrahim latest news, not the man, but the movement. For decades, the Sahel was seen as a chessboard. France moved pawns. The US watched. The UN offered reports. But the people? The people bled, hoped, waited. Now they march. And the irony? As the West scrambles to contain Russian and Chinese influence, it forgets that the true shift isn't East versus West. It's North versus South. It's the colonist reclaiming history. And it's happening faster than anyone expected. But this shift isn't smooth. It's met with pushback, covered funding for opposition parties, subtle economic sabotage, attempts to control media narratives. The same tools, recycled. But now, Africa sees them for what they are. The veil has been lifted. And the youth, oh, the youth, they're not afraid. They don't carry colonial trauma. They carry smartphones. They tweet resistance, film injustice, remix speeches into anthems. They are Sankara's dream with Wi-Fi. They are Traore's army without guns. Still, this is fragile. One mistake, one misstep, and the machine could strike back harder. That's why this moment needs more than admiration. It needs action. It needs elders to share memory. It needs churches to preach justice. It needs schools to teach truth. And it needs you. Because this movement will not be televised by the BBC. It will not be praised by Le Monde. But it will be remembered in WhatsApp chains, street murals, village drums. So let us ask you now, what part will you play in this? Will you be silent, or will you speak? Will you watch, or will you walk with us? Comment below if you believe Africa deserves not just respect but real independence. And if your heart beats a little louder every time you hear a black leader speak without fear, subscribe now. Don't miss the story they hope you forget. Stay with us. The real revolution is quiet until it's not. This was more than a speech. It was more than one man with a microphone. What Captain Ibrahim Traore ignited in May 2025 wasn't a scandal, it was a signal. A signal that the age of submission is ending. That Africa is not waiting for permission to rise. That colonial whispers and neo-colonial hands are finally being named, shamed, and shaken off. For France, the message is bitter. The facade of partnership is crumbling. Its grip on currency, media, and military influence is slipping. The world sees it now not as a helper, but as a hanger-on. Captain Ibrahim latest news doesn't read like a diplomatic update, it reads like a declaration of liberation. And as for Burkina Faso latest news, it's not about crisis, it's about courage. About a small, landlocked country punching far above its weight in the global arena. Not with weapons but with will. So now, we pass the question to you, do you believe this is a turning point? Will more African nations follow? Will Traore's voice echo louder than the ones who tried to silence Sankara? Type your thoughts below. Say it loud, whether it's hope, rage, doubt, or joy. This is a space to speak. And if you believe Africa is writing its own chapter at last, hit subscribe. Because this channel doesn't just cover history, we uncover it. We remember what they tried to erase. And we speak the stories they still want quiet. If this story moved something in your chest, don't scroll past. Like, share, speak, subscribe, because they hid our history long enough. Let's speak our future out loud. Thank you for being here. We'll see you in the next story, the kind they still don't want you to hear. Africa New.